Oh, I do see Hayden. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're gonna get started here soon. We're streaming in. Just gonna give it a couple of minutes before we start as folks join in. Feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining from and what brings you here today. As we wait to get started, I just want to double check. Hayden, is Marie present now?
Yeah, she's here. We're just getting coffee and coming back together.
Perfect, perfect. All right, I'm gonna start an introduction in a minute or two, and then we'll wait for Marie to join in as well.
Okay, well, she's on her way.
Awesome. Perfect, 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 perfect. All right. So just wanted to say hello and welcome everyone to our Zoom webinar today. My name is Khulud Beg. I am with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. I'm a researcher with them. I'm joining today from Calgary, which is in Treaty 7 territory, traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani region, the nations, the Tsuut'ina, the Eari Nakota nations, and the Métis Region 3, and all of the other urban Indigenous folks that call Calgary their home. Just want to acknowledge my presence on this land, and as well want to acknowledge the commitment that the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network has to working on decolonization and Indigenous self-determination and all of the work that we do on housing. I'm moderating the session today that is going to be mainly led by Lisa Neal and Marie McGregor Peter, and I'll quickly pass it on to them. But before that, I just wanted to give a little bit of housekeeping to everyone. So we are joining today on Zoom, and I think by this time, most folks are probably really familiar with Zoom. Zoom controls are all at the bottom of your screen. We encourage people to stay muted throughout the call. If you want to add a comment or participate, please feel free to use the chat while the speakers are speaking. After the speakers are done speaking, we are going to go into a Q&A. At that time, you can either use the raise hand option that's at the bottom of your screen. You can write your question in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just kind of say a little hello so I know that you are there and you want to ask a question. I also just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and it will be made available publicly. So if you are uncomfortable with your face being on camera, I would recommend that you keep off camera, and that's perfectly fine. And also, if you would like your full name to not appear anywhere publicly, I would recommend now for you to change your full name to an alias or a name that you're comfortable being shown publicly, just because we want to make sure that everybody's comfortable. I also want to acknowledge that this session is being offered as part of the Secure Indigenous Land Tenure Association Conference. The CILTA conference is held over 2 days, which is currently the second day today, and is held by the CILTA Association that is led by Marie McGregor Peter, who's also the co-chair for the National Indigenous Housing Network. As we work through today, we're going to be here for around an hour, after which folks that are attending as part of CILTA can head back into the main room for the conference. Everybody else who's just joining for the webinar session is welcome to stay for the hour, and then we'll be sharing a Google form for people who'd like to be engaged further to just let us know how they'd like to be engaged. Before further ado, I just want to quickly introduce our speakers and then pass it on to them so that they can lead us through the rest of the session. We're joined today by Marie McGregor Peter, who is an Anishinaabe on Dolgoning, which is Manitoulin Island, northeastern Ontario, Canada. Marie has developed a business called GBGen Training Services, which provide training and development to First Nation communities and NGOs, primarily in Northwestern Ontario, focused on community and business development. Her business won an award from Northern Ontario Business Awards, and in 2014, shortly after returning to her home community at Whitefish River First Nation, she was evicted from the original family home and became homeless. Her belief was and is that Indigenous people already own the land, so there was and is no need to purchase the land that one's already on. And that's all of the work that Marie also does through the Secure Indigenous Land Tenure Association. She created a tiny home situated in the woods on Whitefish River Reserve on unused land where she lived off the grid for 3 years. In 2018, Marie was evicted from her home in Whitefish River Reserve and became homeless again. And then in 2019, Marie was accepted as a member of the Wikwamacong unceded territory. Marie does amazing work as the co-chair of the National Indigenous Housing Network and is joined today and will be speaking to the work that we're doing at the National Indigenous Housing Network. We're also joined today by Lisa, who's a researcher, housing and homelessness researcher at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and Women's and National Housing and Homelessness Network's key Indigenous partner, Keepers of the Circle. Lisa holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Laurentian University and a law degree from University of Ottawa. She's a lawyer with extensive legal and research experience and has worked with women's shelters and Indigenous organizations in the area of human trafficking, housing precarity, trauma-informed care, and policy and legal initiatives. Her work is based on homelessness prevention and housing solutions, human rights, policy initiatives, gender-based violence, and working with lived experts with a focus on Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. Lisa's also going to introduce herself as she starts speaking. So I'm now going to stop and I'll pass it to Lisa and Marie to get us started. If there is any question at any time, please feel free to use the chat and we can help you make sure that the conference is as accessible for you as possible. Thank you, everyone.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to be with you today. I'm just wondering if Marie wanted to give a little introduction before I started.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. This presentation is called Even the Beaver Has a Home. And a couple of years ago, I was in discussions with different groups, and they went on and on and on about financialization of real estate and mortgages and loans and costs and credit ratings, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They were all about money. And yet we were talking about housing and homelessness. So I put up my little hand and I sneaked in a comment. And I said, you know what? There's an animal out there, doesn't have a spoken language, got 4 legs, has no bank account, has no credit rating, has no mortgage, and yet he, she, they are able to build a home for their family that's safe, secure, private, and meets their needs. There was a kind of a little silence for about a minute, and then all of a sudden it shifted, and then we started talking about what's possible, and then what's creative and what's imaginative, and then we got back on track about housing. So anyway, the work that Lisa and I will be talking about, the title came from that discussion, Even the Beaver Has a Home. And we're hearing about housing as a national crisis now. And we're hearing about how severe and high interest the mortgages are for the mainstream Canadian population. And we're hearing about the high incidences of homelessness, not just in Canada, but all over the world. And so the discussion will be about how even the Beaver has a home. And the work we're doing is through the National Indigenous Housing Network and also the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, where I serve as a co-chair. And in June 2022, two groups, the National Indigenous Housing Network and the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, submitted a human rights claim to the federal government, citing the right to housing and citing the origins of those rights through international covenants and treaties and other legally binding instruments, and how those instruments and covenants apply also here in Canada. And in the National Indigenous Housing Network claim, there were 4 violations of the right to housing that were cited, and then a discussion about how severe and protracted and widespread the lack of housing is, insecure housing, homelessness, precarious housing. And I want to say that those that are living in nursing homes, that are incarcerated, that are in retirement homes, that are in hospitals, long-term care facilities, those are also a type of homeless. And also, if you have a home with a mortgage, if you are 2 or 3 payments away from not being able to make that mortgage payment, you're at risk of homelessness. In addition to the usual images we have of people living in tent communities all over the continent. And so it was a description of some of those realities for Indigenous women, Two-Spirit girls, gender diverse, and women. So the human rights claim was launched. It was officially presented in June in 2022. And in the report, in the claim, were described 12 recommendations that, if acted upon, would right the wrongs that the abrogation of the right to housing was highlighted. So, according to our information, the federal government had 120 days to respond. One of the responses was to do some work with the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. And the name of the project, Even the Beaver Has a Home, is the name of that project. And what it is a way to ask communities if we can visit those communities and talk about what are those realities, how were your rights abrogated, what stories do you have about being homeless, about being precariously housed, and what would you like to see as a remedy? So that's what our discussion is about today. I'd like to turn it now to Lisa, if you want to run with the next part, Lisa.
Yes, thank you very much, Marie. I'm very honored to be here with all of you today and to be presenting with the very wise and knowledgeable Marie. She is really the guide to us in all of our work with these claims. So I'm just going to explain to you a little bit about that and then explain to you the Even the Beaver Has a Home project that Marie was just talking about. So I won't go through who we are because Marie and Khulud already did that. So I'm just going to skip right to claiming our right to housing. This is a historic human rights review, and it begins now with all the hard work that's been happening. So a little bit of an overview. I'll be explaining the act, the parties, and the process of this new legislation. So just a little bit about the human right to housing in general, just to situate us. And then what is the National Housing Strategy Act? I'll explain. What is the Federal Housing Advocate? I'll explain a little bit about the NIN claim, which is called Homeless on Homelands. Then the upcoming review panel on Indigenous women's homelessness. And finally, the upcoming NIN engagements, which are titled Even the Beaver Has a Home. So what is the human right to housing? The human right to adequate housing is not a new concept. It's actually a fundamental human right that is recognized under international law and was recognized as early as the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Canada agreed to the progressive realization of the right to housing and an adequate standard of living in 1976, when its signature on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights came into force. And Canada's commitment to the human right to adequate housing was reaffirmed in 2019 when Parliament passed the National Housing Strategy Act. Approaching housing as a human right reinforces the intrinsic link between the right to housing and human dignity. It also connects the human right to housing to other fundamental human rights, such as the right to life, work, physical and mental health, social security, political participation, and education. Using a human rights-based approach to housing policy reinforces the expectation that legislation, policies, and programs affecting housing will emphasize participation, empowerment, accountability, and non-discrimination while fulfilling the human right to adequate housing. Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender-diverse people are experiencing some of the most egregious right to housing violations all across Canada. They are overrepresented in almost all aspects of housing security, homelessness, and poverty, and are disproportionately impacted by violence and trauma linked to precarious living situations. These violations are a result of historic and ongoing attempts by the Canadian state to colonize Indigenous peoples, our culture, and our ways of living, doing, and being. In the face of these attempts, our peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, have resisted and mobilized, continuing to uphold traditional ways. They continue to navigate and survive violent systems of institutionalization and exclusion, practicing their cultures through land and water stewardship, and utilizing mechanisms like international and human rights covenants and declarations to assert their rights. And now we are using one of these very mechanisms and this new federal legislation to do just that in Canada. The National Housing Strategy Act is a legislation that we're going to be using to do that. In 2019, Parliament passed the National Housing Strategy Act, the NHSA, which recognizes housing as a human right and commits the federal government to further the right to adequate housing. The Act establishes accountability tools to help support the right to housing in Canada, and it also establishes three important things: a national housing strategy, which supports the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing, a National Housing Council to oversee the implementation of that strategy, and importantly, a federal housing advocate to promote and protect the right to housing in Canada. The National Housing Council's duties include promoting participation and inclusion in the development of housing policy, providing advice to the minister responsible for housing on how to improve housing conditions, and offering advice to the effectiveness of the National Housing Strategy to the minister. And very importantly, this is the first Canadian legislation to ever recognize a socioeconomic right as a fundamental human right, the first one to ever commit to the progressive realization of that right to housing based on international human law, address systemic issues rather than violations of individual rights, require a rights-based strategy that has goals, timelines, monitoring, and accountability, and provides for submissions, hearings, findings, and systemic remedies for socioeconomic right. So what is the Federal Housing Advocate? The Federal Housing Advocate is an independent, nonpartisan watchdog empowered to drive meaningful action to address housing need and homelessness in Canada. The Office of the Federal Housing Advocate helps to promote and protect the right to housing in Canada. The goal of the advocate's work is to drive key change on systemic housing issues and advance the right to housing for all in Canada. The advocate is intended to monitor the human right to adequate housing and the National Housing Strategy, and to ensure a meaningful voice and role for affected individuals and community. Her work includes stakeholder engagement and analyzing and conducting research, initiating studies, and consulting on systemic housing issues. The advocate is responsible for driving meaningful action to address inadequate housing and homelessness in Canada. And importantly, the office is empowered to receive complaints from individuals with lived experience of housing need and or homelessness, work with vulnerable groups and civil society organizations, review and assess submissions on systemic housing issues under federal jurisdiction, and conduct research on systemic housing issues. So how are we mobilizing this legislation to claim our rights under the housing, under this new housing act? Sorry, how are we claiming our rights to housing to mobilize under this act? Well, the two ways that these three organizations have done that in a really remarkable and groundbreaking way are through the two claims. So I will speak to you today about the NIN claim. So that's the National Indigenous Housing Network claim. On June 14th, as Marie and Claude both explained to us, 2022, last year, the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, together with NIN, came together with Keepers of the Circle to submit 2 human rights claims to the Federal Housing Advocate. These groups came together to utilize these new procedures under the NHSA to claim the right to housing and the right to substantive equality. The claims spotlight violations of the right to housing experienced by marginalized women and gender diverse people across the country, and it calls for immediate action. The claims demand a better future for Indigenous women, children, and communities, and the planet as a whole. The claims are a call on the Government of Canada to fully realize the inherent human right to housing and to be held accountable for the human rights violations being perpetuated against Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people. The document is written in 2 parts. The first part articulates the human rights frameworks as listed in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's and Girls Report and connects them to the right to housing. The second part of the claim details key violations of housing rights impacting Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse peoples. The violations I'm going to go over with you today are not exhaustive or comprehensive, but are driven by discussions held by the original working group. And we recognize that as we embark on this evidence building process for this claim, the violations highlighted will become more comprehensive and serve as a process for women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people and Indigenous people articulating the right to housing on their own terms, which is really an essential part of these claims and of the way forward. So the NIN claim is called Homeless on Homelands. Homelessness amongst Indigenous girls and gender diverse people in Canada is directly linked to ongoing colonialism and genocide being committed against Indigenous peoples. The settler colonial project of Canada, beginning in the 1600s, upholds structures that undermine the position of Indigenous women. Colonial structures dehumanize and oppress Indigenous women, subjecting them to poverty, rape, sexual violence, and murder. Colonialism creates the conditions for homelessness and housing need amongst Indigenous women. In the context of inherent Indigenous rights, the NHSA emerges as a critical instrument that can be utilized to challenge colonial policies and mechanisms that attempt to displace women from their proper power and place. To understand the scale and depth of ongoing housing rights violations experienced by Indigenous women, we urge through these claims the federal housing advocate to examine the interconnected areas of human rights. So the first part of the claim are to put forth to the government the actual what has been violated here. And the violation of the human rights, this comes from the TRC Commission and the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Report, are the violation of the right to culture, the violation of the right to health, the violation of the right to security, and the violation of the right to justice. Each of these areas intersects and overlaps with housing as a human right and ultimately ties to the reclamation of power and place for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. The second part of the claim focuses on 4 key violations and systemic issues. And the violations listed in this claim, again, by no means capture the full scale and the depth of the problem, but are meant to be starting points to articulate this to the government. So the first violation included in the claim is a lack of action on the calls to justice from the inquiry into the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report and the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation report. The MMIWG report has documented housing rights violations and Indigenous women extensively through the testimonies of family members of murdered and missing Indigenous women and gender diverse individuals. Those testimonies speak powerfully to the lack of safe, culturally appropriate, and adequate housing within the larger context of the colonial genocide that displaces Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse individuals from their homelands. This multi-layered oppression has created circumstances of extreme vulnerability to violence and marginalization for women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people in their communities. The TRC report, as we all know, documented this genocidal violence of residential schools and its intergenerational trauma and continuing impacts and legacies on our communities. It created the 94 calls to action to support reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. The second violation that is highlighted in the claim is the failure to provide safe, adequate, and culturally appropriate housing on our terms, and also focuses on housing indiscrimination created through the Indian Act and the manufactured crisis of housing on reserves and its impact on women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people. The Government of Canada has failed to provide safe, adequate, and culturally appropriate housing that meets the diverse needs of Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people from coast to coast to coast. Decades of underfunding and paternalistic resource allocations to Indigenous people's housing has further left Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people in situations of housing vulnerability and insecurity, and ultimately fails to uphold their housing rights. The third violation focused on in the claim is interjurisdictional neglect, multiple system failure, and institutional betrayal. Interjurisdictional neglect refers to situations when government's lack of interdepartmental cooperation creates barriers for individuals who, as a result of bureaucratic barriers, do not get access to programs and services. A major challenge in the realization of housing as a human right for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people is interjurisdictional neglect created by federal, provincial, and municipal governments. There are huge gaps created between on-reserve and off-reserve governance and services, and gaps between multiple systems like healthcare, child welfare, and the criminal justice system, which institutionalize Indigenous women. Further, funding for Indigenous-led housing and housing services, whether on reserve or off reserve or in the North, is mostly allocated in piecemeal fashion, project by project, which does not address our needs for sustainable, safe, and affordable housing. The last violation highlighted in the claim is security of tenure under the National Housing Strategy and secure Indigenous land tenure. The realization of housing as a human right under the NHSA provides the federal housing advocate with a very unique opportunity to view forced removal of Indigenous peoples from their homelands as not just a violation of their collective Indigenous and human rights. It gives an opportunity to the federal housing advocate to utilize the vehicle of housing as a human right to drive accountability towards Indigenous peoples' restitution to their lands and guaranteed security of tenure on lands that are their homelands. And I know we've spoken a lot about this at this conference already, but home ownership and models of culturally appropriate housing are very important in this claim. An important area in supporting and nurturing housing autonomy for Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people is home ownership and other models that promote culturally appropriate housing. So what is the way forward? The way forward in this is for Indigenous women to exercise of agency, self-reliance, and independence. And as Marie pointed out, the Beaver can make their own home. Advocates from across Canada, including our own expert Marie, highlight the need for housing models and solutions that are environmentally sustainable, locally developed, designed by women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people in our communities, nurture economic and cultural growth, and are situated on lands that are governed by our communities. I encourage everyone attending today to read the claims that have been submitted, which are available on the Women's Network website and through the link that Khulud will put in for us in the chat. But I especially encourage you to read Marie's own powerful words and the telling of her fight for housing rights at pages 44 and 45 of the NIN claim. So through this claim, our goal is that the federal housing advocate, we are calling on the federal housing advocate, will co-produce reviews and recommendations that situate the realization of housing as human right within the interwoven context of inherent Indigenous rights. They are both totally connected as we are put forth in this claim. And we are calling on the federal housing advocate to engage in a decolonized reframing of this right to housing and join Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people in this transformative human rights exercise that situates them as leaders in the process of defining and setting parameters on what the realization of the right to housing means in our community and means to Indigenous women. We are asserting through testimony and evidence given in the TRC and the MMIWG hearings that the Canadian state should no longer impose upon a colonial understanding of the right to housing upon Indigenous women. The intent of this claim is to collectively pursue an exercise in self-determination through articulating what the right to housing means to Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. So there was some very good news, as Marie pointed out in the beginning of the presentation, and something historic is on the horizon. In the coming months, there will be a human rights review focused on the government of Canada's failure to prevent and end homelessness for women and gender diverse people. This review is the first gendered focused review of its kind in Canadian history and is providing new mechanisms to hold the government of Canada accountable for the housing crisis. So on May 11th of this year, 2023, the federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle, made a request to the National Housing Council to launch a review panel on the failure to prevent and eliminate homelessness amongst women and gender diverse people, particularly Indigenous women, gender diverse, and Two-Spirit people. The request comes in response to several submissions to the advocate, including by the Women's Housing and Homelessness Network and NIN, and also Keepers of the Circle. These submissions demonstrate that across Canada, many women, girls, and gender diverse people live in insecure or unsafe housing or are made homeless due to deliberate policy choices. Under the Act, the advocate may decide, which they have done just in May of this year, to refer a systemic housing issue that falls under the jurisdiction of Parliament to the National Housing Council. And request that it forms a review of that council, request that it forms a review panel of 3 council members to examine the issue. The review panel holds a hearing and must offer the public an opportunity to participate. The National Housing Council will establish a 3-person review panel, and it will be responsible for reviewing the issue. The review will involve 2 components, written testimony and oral testimony during public hearings. And there will be public hearings where women and gender diverse people with lived experience will also testify, and experts can also testify. So over the next 6 months, we will be mobilizing across Canada to engage in this historic process. This is a little bit of a slide that explains the steps in the process, and we're here at number 3. So the advocate's recommendations, as well as the new review panel's findings, will help to identify solutions and necessary reforms to Canada's housing laws, policies, and programs. This mechanism is a way to target the most critical systemic issues, as well as urge the government to take action on them. It also gives members of affected communities an opportunity to be included and participate in the process and to contribute to housing policy and solutions. This review panel will dig into why, despite countless recommendations and commitment and many, many years, homelessness among women and gender diverse people, particularly those who are Indigenous, continues to worsen. Central to the review panel is public participation, particularly for communities directly affected by systemic issues. In particular, the review panel is an opportunity to hear from disadvantaged groups, especially Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people. It is critical that right holders be engaged to see themselves in the review panel process, as well as contribute the solutions that they would like to see. And this is why for the next 6 months, we're going to be doing the evidence gathering for these human rights claims. And this is the Even the Beaver Has a Home project that Marie introduced for us. So through this project, we'll be carving a path to realize the right to housing for women and gender diverse people in Canada. And Even the Beaver is a series of 4 engagement sessions, which will aim to gather first person perspectives of violations of the right to housing experienced by Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people from across Canada with living experience of housing precarity. So the objective of this project is to create a body of lived expert evidence that expands upon and provides evidence to support the 2 claims submitted to the Federal Housing Advocate. And what will happen with the evidence that we collect? The advocate will use it to refer, which she's already done, to refer to the National Housing Council. The National Housing Council will use it in their systemic review, and it will inform their recommendations and report. The advocate will highlight it in her annual report. The advocate may use the evidence for other purposes, examples such as convening meetings with the government. And then we can also use it to build a legal case to pursue other actions through the courts. Why does this process matter? Well, it matters a lot because the voices of rights holders are at the forefront, and that's one of the most important things, and one of the things that's often lacking, as we all know, when we're working with governments and we're trying to work through the colonial court system. So the voices of rights holders are at the forefront, which is extremely important. A public record documenting human rights violations will be created. The minister is forced to respond within 120 days. And recommendations can be used to pursue justice at the international level and for many other purposes within our own groups. How can you, excuse me, how can you get involved? Well, you can attend one of the upcoming Even the Beaver Has a Home knowledge gathering sessions. Those sessions there'll be 4 of them, and we're hoping to hold them all across the country, and they will be virtual and in person, hybrid models, I believe. We have not set the dates yet, but we encourage you to stay connected to us. And so you can join our mailing list to stay informed on the dates and locations of upcoming Even the Beaver Has a Home engagement sessions. And you can do that by filling out the Google form linked in the chat. Kalud has put that in the chat. And you can also get in touch with us at info@womenshomelessness.ca at any time for more information. And that concludes my presentation to you today. So thank you, Miigwech, for having me today. It's been an honor to be with you, and we can take any questions and answers. I'm not sure about the timing, but that would be a pleasure for us to do for you today. I think Clint has a question. Go ahead, please, Clint. I kind of thought you might have some questions for us.
Yeah, I remember joining your guys' organization a while back before they put in the women's national. It was just the national housing. And then once you guys put it in the women's national, I thought, well, maybe it's not for me anymore. It sounds like it's designated for women. But yeah, I remember back in the day, I was explaining again our titles, our allodial titles, and you guys were fighting for rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as Indigenous women being Canadian and having those rights. Now, what I was emphasizing before is we're not only Canadian, right? We've never abandoned our nationhood to become only Canadian and assimilate into the Canadian society. We never enfranchised ourselves to become only Canadian or British citizens. And it's great that you guys are doing a lot of important work there, but nobody's ever taken Canada to the International Criminal Court under their nationhood. Because you can't take Canada to the International Criminal Court for acts of genocide if you're an Indigenous Canadian, because that's a domestic issue now. The International Criminal Court doesn't deal with domestic issues. They deal with international issues like the Cree Nationals and the Crown. That's a different story now. So yes, you guys are fighting for the Canadian rights, which yes, we do have, because Canada gave us those when they deemed us human. They said, okay, you could have some Canadian rights, but we never abandoned our allodial title and our inherent rights that we've always had before Canada ever existed. So my question is, has anybody even looked at taking Canada to the International Criminal Court for these same issues?
Good question.
Oh, sorry. I'll just respond quickly to Clint, and then I'll let the other person speak. So Clint, those are really big issues. And I know you've brought them up several times throughout the conference here. And I think they're wonderful issues. And I think, Clint, all I can tell you is that we are working, unfortunately, within the colonial government and court framework, but I think we're getting closer to the things that you're talking about. Like we're stepping closer every minute, every year, every day to self-government on our terms, to own the land on our terms, to not, to the allodial land concepts. Like there's some really, really exciting things going on. And for the first time, probably in my entire legal career, in my entire life, I'm really encouraged by some of these things. And that's what you're talking about, going to the International Criminal Court and the international, like the Hague, and those are some really, really big concepts and some really big things. But the smaller steps that we're taking right now, like these claims, Clint, I really encourage you to go look at them. They're 50 pages each, but they're amazing. And there's so much good info there that could be used by, another group or other people to, like, we're getting there. I think we're climbing the mountain very slowly, and I think what you're talking about and what the other speakers, Terry and the other speakers have talked about as well within the conference is where we're headed and where we're going. What we're doing, like Clint, is just like everybody else right now. We're using the government's own money. We're using their own frameworks. We're using, their resources, and we're gaining all of this knowledge as Indigenous, lawyers, people, women, girls, everybody. And we're going to use this sort of, like, not against them, but to work with, we're still working with them, but we're breaking it away. And these are the little steps that we're taking to do that. So I know that doesn't really answer your question, Clint, but
It does. No, it does.
okay, good.
One quick follow-up though, particularly for you. When you passed the bar, who did you swear the oath to? To Canada or to the Crown? And I don't mean the federal Crown. I'm talking about the King or the previous Queen, if you passed the bar when she was still alive. The Crown, whoever wears the crown. Did you swear an oath to Canada or to the Crown?
To be honest, Clint, that was 18 years ago, so I don't honestly quite remember, but I know it was to both concepts. Like in my mind, it was the both colonial, like the Crown, the government, it's all like, but I always felt that there was more to what I was doing, and that there was, and I can tell you that there's been leaps and bounds between, and I do understand that we're being educated in the colonial framework, but things are improving tremendously. Like the education that Cattleya is getting now is heads and tails above what I received 20 years ago. Like we didn't even talk about this in these spheres. Like we had Aboriginal law classes. Now it's Indigenous law classes. So no longer are we, interpreting Indigenous law through what the government and the colonial people are telling us. We're doing it on our own terms. So things have changed. Like I can't even begin to express to you. I know it seems like there's a long way to go, but we're educating our own people. We're using the colonial frameworks to really get far. So I think Khulud has a few things to say here too. So,
I appreciate it.
trying,
Thank
Clint.
you.
We're trying, lawyers, and like we're not all terrible people. And I'm really using my education and my skills and my knowledge to help my people now finally. So it makes me really happy.
I'm not intervening. I just wanted to also acknowledge that I believe Marie has her hand up as well and would like to add.
You can go ahead, Marie.
Yeah, responding to Clint's question. So how the National Indigenous Housing Network started was through the National Indigenous Feminist Housing Network, and it was in response to a lot of the findings that were in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls final report, and the egregious crimes that were committed against the women. Women were murdered and missing, and many of the bodies have never been found. The people have never been found. And even now, there is a debate about whether or not to excavate through the Winnipeg landfill to find the remains of 2 Indigenous women who were murdered. So there's that. It was intended to exclude Indigenous men. It's just that the severity and horror of what was happening to Indigenous women at the time was what pushed it front and center for us. And so the claim is by the National Indigenous Housing Network, and it includes Indigenous women, girls, gender diverse and two-spirit people. And the purpose of the claim, supposed after all that work that nothing comes of what we said. My consolation is that the stories that are gathered and the testimony that's brought forward will be on the public record. And that's really, really important because it'll be documented someplace. So that 50 years from now, if the issues are still outstanding with regard to homelessness and housing, people that come after us will be able to look back on the public record and say, hey, way back in 2023, these things were talked about, and here are the stories. The other part that's important is that because of the trauma experienced by many homeless and inadequately housed people, those stories need to be collected so that a person has a voice, and then 2, that voice is shared with others, and that others will, who have had the same experience, can say, oh, so-and-so went through that. Maybe I shouldn't feel so terrible. I can share my story too. And so the circle spreads. And now you have the documentation of people sharing their stories. And once you release something like that, there's a way that the release into the universe becomes a kind of healing. And so it helps people on their healing journey. And that's part of what appeals to me about the next stage of Even the Beaver Has a Home, is to meet people and hear their stories, allow them to release these things that are pent up, and allow them to ask the universe for that healing that they need. And then finally for the powers that be to say, hey, wait a minute, there's a severe housing crisis in Canada. What are we going to do? And the other part of it is to go back to what I mentioned yesterday, is that 50,000 years ago, we were alive and well on this great turtle island. We were able to provide homes and housing for ourselves. And it exercised 3 things. One is agency, the other is autonomy, and the other is independence. So some of those things are missing from our communities and our nations now. And what we want to do with taking some of this back is to put those back in place, so that we can exercise our agency, our autonomy, and our independence. And so that's what I'm hoping is one of the outcomes of Even the Beaver Has a Home project. So I just wanted to respond to Clint's question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. We also have Steve who has a question. Steve, you can go ahead.
Tanshe, we raise our hands to you all from Tillicum for the good work you're doing on behalf of our young mums with their children who can't find homes. My question is that in this plan, is there a focus as well on the financialization of this housing market and these corporations, these capitalist corporations that control the majority of rental units across our territories, and holding the government to account? They are supported by that business group, and I think they're a big part of the problem. Heitske.
Thank you, Steve. I'm gonna pass it to Lisa and Marie to take this question.
I can just start quickly on that. What I can tell you, Steve, is that part of the national strategy, the housing strategy, is actually supported by a huge amount of money by the CMHC. So as you know, that's the Colonial Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. I believe the amount is $6 billion or $8 billion. And that is to work towards the exact issues that you're talking about. So within this structure, it is very, very much recognized that the financialization of the housing market, it's a problem throughout the country, not just for Indigenous people, but felt particularly strongly by Indigenous people. So there are a lot of studies being done. There is a lot of money out there. And I think the real solution, Steve, is to, these are much broader topics than I am qualified to speak of, but the solution is to bring this in-house into communities, right? And it's some of the things that we were talking about yesterday. I don't know if you were here for that part, but to have our own manufacturing companies, to make our own homes and make our own housing and do it affordably. And so there are a lot of ideas out there, but that is definitely at the forefront of some of the things that we're talking about. And that the National Housing Strategy under the CMHC, again, all colonial constructs, all governed by the government, all managed by the government. But we can use their money and some of those policies to sort of create our own housing industry, even maybe sort of what we're aiming for here. So
if I can add to that, yes, the community engagements that are coming up will be so that we can reach people in the north and the west and the east and the south. Some of them will be in person, others online and or hybrid. So we want to hear the stories and hear about people's experiences. But there are a couple of other things happening in the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate and the National Housing Council. There's a review panel coming up on financialization, I believe. And that discussion will be all about the real estate industry and the financialization of housing. Very severe and deep-rooted discussion that needs to take place. And I think there will be another one just on tent villages. I refuse to use the word encampments. Some of you may know why, but let me quickly explain. I prefer to use the word tent villages and tent communities. And in the literature, they talk about encampments. To me, when I hear the word encampments, I have a vision of a little family loading up a tent in the back of their SUV and taking their 2.5 children out to the park or a campground or somewhere, camping for a couple of days, enjoying it all and packing the tent back into their vehicle and going home again. To me, that's camping. To me, what they have done is an encampment. It's temporary. What really happens is that the people that are using tents to live in are creating tent villages and they're creating tent communities. Because all of a sudden there's a group of them together. Someone from one tent will come along to the other one and say, hey, I know where you can get some great soup and salmon today. And they'll pass that along. A little while later, someone else will come along and say, hey, I know where you can go and have a shower. And they'll pass that along. Another one will come along and say, hey, I know where you can do laundry. Oh my goodness. All of those services that they're bringing and telling each other about, those are community services. The people that are living in those arrangements are in tent villages and tent communities. They've organized and they're there to help each other out. And the moment you set up a tent, you're exercising agency and autonomy and independence. Never mind that it's a tent, it's a shelter. That's the beginnings of your independence. And I speak from experience and I talk about that. So a tent village, a tent community is an organized system where people are living in an arranged fashion and helping each other out and helping themselves. So I'm sorry, I digress, but there I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Wondering if there is more questions that folks have for our speakers. And I don't know if there's any more. I'll send Patron and say.
We do have a question in the room.
Okay, yeah, for sure. Go ahead.
Terry, I'm also here. Everything boils down to money, you see. Not the country is the problem. Affording a house. We'd like to magically produce all the material to build a house. What it costs, 3-bedroom house, I don't know how much today you pay for labor, just for labor, never mind the material. So that's an issue that I think, you know, to make it within reach, how do we deal with the cost? I mean, most of our people, a lot of our people are simply not within reach of, you know, having one of these mortgages from CMHC unless they're on social assistance for the rest of their life, you know? And even the CMHC loans in, there in Chagany, you have to go through the bank process. They have to see if you make enough money to, but that's what we're dealing with is our impoverishment. How do we overcome this financial obstacle? You know, that's a reality. We have to come to terms with it, find answers to it. And I haven't been able to envision anything.
Lisa.
I
Yeah.
can sort of take a stab at answering that. That's a very big thank you, Terry, for your very thoughtful. You've had many thoughtful questions throughout the conference. It's a very big question, and it's really it's something that needs to be. It's what Marie talked about. It's something that the federal advocate's actually looking at, the financialization of housing. That's a main issue from across the country. So I mean, we don't have any answers within the claim. We're just telling the government that these are issues that need to be dealt with. But some of the answers, Terry, I believe are gonna come from this process and are going to come from people like Marie and advocates like the people in the room with you, because we're and the amazing women like Colleen Carpenter and Lynn Cormier from yesterday that are actually doing the work, and Becky Big Canoe, right? They're sourcing products. They're, you know, we may have to have our own supplies of materials in order to make it more affordable. We may have to have our own manufacturing to make it more affordable. We may have to have you know, these are, again, really big concepts, and there are lots of ideas out there, but the way the status quo can't be maintained, the way it isn't affordable. A home isn't affordable for even the average person, and certainly not for Indigenous women and people in community, right, and people in poverty. So these are really big, huge questions, and really big, and they're really big obstacles, Terry. They really are. So, but I mean, I think there's solutions, and I think there's little steps of solutions that will, you know, help us overcome that big mountain of, and I mean, cost. It's always about money, right? Everything is always about money, but I think there are ways. I really believe there are ways, and I think Marie believes there are ways, and I think that working together in community and working on these projects together, we're going to find some of those ways. So
yeah, if I can add to that, I mentioned living in the tent. I was roaming around one day on the island here and happened to stop at a yard sale, and the guy at the yard sale looked at me and says, "You wouldn't happen to be needing a tent, would you?" And I happened to be needing a tent. I said, "Sure, let me have a look." So I had a look at it. It had all its parts and everything. $20, and I walked away happy. So I went around and looked for some territory to put it on. I found an unused piece of land on the res at Whitefish River, and went over there, and it had what I needed. And I needed safety, security, privacy, access to roadway, I needed water, and I needed firewood. It had all of those things. So I went and I looked for a spot to put this tent. And I went and talked to that land, and I asked it, "Is it okay if I come here for a bit? I promised to clean up, and I promised not to make a mess." And I think it said okay. So anyhow, I started with a tent. Then a little while later, I was able to get an 8x10 shed. I think it was like $500. So I had it hauled over to that same area and put it up. It became a sleeping monkey, and I had a fireplace outside that I could cook on. And then a couple months later, there was another building available. This time it was a garage, 8x14. I think I paid $700 for it. So I had it brought over. By this time, it's getting to be winter. And then I had friends and relatives help, and they put the two buildings together, took off the garage door, put on a people door, put a wood stove in, and then had it insulated. Now I had a 2-room tiny home. And then a little while later, I ended up taking carpentry in Wiki, Cambrian College. And with those skills, I learned to salvage materials nearby. I took an old billboard and hauled it over and put it next to this 2-room tiny home. And then I took driftwood from the lake, and then I used some new materials, but mostly recycled and salvaged. And then added on an 8x8 room to that. So now I had a 3-room tiny home. So what I'm saying is begin at the beginning. Start small, start with what you can do, and ask your friends and relatives for help. I did not need to go and get a mortgage. I did not go to a housing program on the res. I did this on my own with friends and relatives' help and with Mother Earth's help. So there are ways to do this. And we need to be very creative and imaginative. We need to drill down to what do we need, not what do we want. Because it's not about what we want, it's about what we need, okay? So I just wanted to add that there are ways to do this. And we very gradually, all of us in the nations, need to get away from this money system because that's what's dragging us down. What is a reserve? A reserve is 5 C's: corralled, contained, captured, controlled, and counted. If you're on the res, that's what the 5 C's do to you, okay? It's just a little thought to take away.
Good, Marie. I think we have another 5 to 10 minutes to take questions, and then we'd like to wrap up. I see a question in the chat, so I'll quickly go through them. And Lisa and Marie, if you can answer those concisely, we can get through more. So one of the questions is, what would be the ideal outcomes, ideal outcome for the work that we're doing for grassroots people? What are we hoping to get as our ideal outcome from this work?
I'll leave that to, I'm just going to, sorry, Marie, I'll let you speak. I'm just going to post some slides. We have some outcomes from the actual, I didn't have enough time to go through them in my presentation, but while Marie speaks, I'll just put the slides up and slowly go through them of the actual outcomes. There's a lot of them. It's very detailed. So we didn't just put forth the claim. We actually have some real world things that we'd like to have happen from them. So I'm just going to share that while Marie, sorry to interrupt you, Marie, while Marie speaks.
Thanks, Lisa, that helps a lot. So yesterday too, we started talking about governance by the grandmothers, the inclusion back into our nation's continuing development. And it includes the female. And so we have an egalitarian system that needs to be reinstituted. Also, as Clint mentioned as well, we already own the land, so we need to start behaving as if we do. And the other one has to do with communities that we create ourselves that meet our needs. For example, there was a discussion about housing that includes intergenerational, not intergenerational, but the extended family, let's say. So grandparents and great aunties and great uncles and the children and parents, the cousins and so on. There are even some families that have family composition that is not blood related. I have a sister that lives in Alberta, and she and her husband are part of another family that they're not even related to, and yet they're family. So even the definition of family can be flexible. And we need communities that are culturally appropriate, that take into account the needs and how to take care of ourselves as a result of the hunting, the trapping, the fishing, the gathering, the gardening, and making our own materials and using resources that are available to us. So recreating communities that meet our needs is a way to solve the issue. And so there are very many creative ways to do this, and part of gathering the stories will be to ask people how they see the outcomes and the resolutions of this. Okay, over to Lisa and your chart.
Okay, thank you, Marie. I'm not going to go through all of these, but so the 3 big areas were articulation of rights by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And here, some of the recommendations were having the federal advocate appoint an actual panel of Indigenous knowledge keepers, elders, and advocates to direct the Indigenous-led housing claims submitted to the advocate. having an oversight body of Indigenous peoples to hold authority, meaningfully engage with the National Action Plan, and particularly advocate for the establishment of an Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal. So that would be very important to have an Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal. That's something very unique. Support and co-develop process of evidence building as part of this claim, like we talked about. And then so on housing development, a couple of the things were to promote, like Marie just explained, self-determination, advocating for housing designed by Indigenous people, built by Indigenous people, and applying biophilic design and environmentally friendly materials. The advocate create pathways to measurable targets for home design, construction, accessibility to building materials to be set so that the severe conditions of inadequate housing, homelessness, and overcrowding, unsanitary conditions can be ameliorated. And then the final one was on housing funding. So again, by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And there's a whole bunch of recommendations here. But the most important thing at this point that it's critical to note that all of these recommendations are rooted in the principles of self-determination and Indigenous women, two spirits, and gender diverse people articulating what the right to housing means to them. So although we're talking about some things here, we're hoping to get to know what women want, what women need, what women want, what will work in the communities, what will work for Indigenous women, and have their voices heard. So not just having the colonial governments telling us what to do and how to do it and how to be funded and how to have our rights heard and expressed. And so it's a very unique thing what we're doing here, I think. So I'm excited about it.
Thank you so much, Lisa and Marie. I just have the last question from Amanda, and then we're hoping to wrap up. So Amanda, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm from Six Nations and I had my own experience for decades of homelessness because of inadequate amount of housing on reserve. So I was forced at a very young age to move to the city and I lost, everything like culture, family connections, all of that. And I haven't been able to be home yet. Like I've visited, but my point was to get back. So I've gone through this and it's like everybody's struggle. All the reserves are suffering this in North America. But what I wanted to just comment was we're spiritual beings and we're spiritual people and we're all creators and we were given the power to create. And what I wanted to remind anyone who knows, I want to remind everybody to we have the power of manifestation, and what happens is what we believe happens, and what we think happens. It becomes our reality. So if we want to change these things, we can envision that change and result. Even the monies we need, we can do all of these things, all the justice we need. It applies to many areas, not just housing, language, children back, all of the things it applies to. But it's not just a 3D physical reality. And the more time we keep sending warriors out to the front lines to fight the government, they get worn out, they get defeated, they get hopeless. But we miss the whole process of we're spiritual beings first, and we first need to manifest these visions and believe them into reality. And then they, like law, the universe, like law, has to create these things and deliver them back to us. So I just want to remind people not to forget about that process.
Good point. It's part of our laws, right? That's good.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that note. And I think that's such a brilliant note to also wrap up our talk today on. I know some folks are joining today from the Secure Indigenous Land Tenure Association. I'm posting a Zoom link in the chat. If you're returning back to that conference, please do so using that link. I also posted a link for our Google form. If you want to stay connected with this work, if you want to continue participating in this work, it would be amazing to have you in our circle and have you participate in our ongoing efforts to achieve housing as a human right for everyone. The work that National Indigenous Housing Network does expands beyond working on advocacy into actually striving for what housing models and housing builds for Indigenous by Indigenous look like. If that's something that interests you, I recommend that you fill out the form and participate in the work in an ongoing way. I am going to wrap up today. I just wanted to thank Marie and Lisa for their time and their energy. I know that Marie, you're going to continue on with the conference today, so that's amazing. The link for the conference is in the chat if people are returning back to the conference for the rest of the day. In the meantime, I just want to thank everyone that took the time to join us today virtually. Thank you so much for participating in this conversation, for bringing your perspectives and views, and we're really looking forward to working together on this with everyone. National Indigenous Housing Network is hoping to host 4 sessions on housing as a human right for Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. And if that's a conversation that interests you, please let us know and we will be in touch with you. Thank you so much once again and take care.
Yeah.